Bos días. É unha honra e un prazer presentar ao noso seguinte convidado. Difícil tamén resumir o seu currículum. Ele é Óscar Westlund, ven de Suecia, profesor asociado da Universidade de Göteborgs, no país sueco, e profesor adxunto tamén na Universidade de Volda, en Noruega. As súas liñas de investigación céntranse nas transformacións e relacións entre os medios tradicionais e os novos medios, con especial fincapé nesa relación entre os medios tradicionais e os dispositivos móbiles. Ele é membro do Consello Editorial de revistas de prestixio internacional como a revista Digital Journalism ou Mobile Media and Communication. Na actualidade, lidera un gran proxecto de investigación sobre epistemoloxías da produción de noticias digitais, financiado pola Fundación Sueca de Humanidades e Ciencias Sociais. É un prazer contar coa súa presenza hoxe aquí no Consello da Cultura Galega, dámoslle a benvida e dámoslle paso á súa conferencia titulada Produción e consumo de información en móbiles, unha visión do panorama europeo. Moitas grazas. Óscar.
Muchas gracias, Alba, y muchas gracias por la invitación. I will switch to English because it's my second language. I used to speak some Spanish. I've tried to comprehend here what Juan Miguel was speaking about in his presentation. It seemed very good. I am struggling, though, with comprehending Spanish, and I hope that you will understand me as I speak in English. So basically, what I will try to accomplish with this presentation is to provide you with an overview from an ongoing research review that I'm doing for some different handbooks and encyclopedias on mobile media and mobile journalism to be published next year. I will touch upon some of the topics that other presenters have done already and will do in the afternoon on mobile journalism and mojos and so forth, but basically to provide you with an outline. And I'm very thrilled to be here in Spain at last with the colleagues of the Mobile News Project. I'm also very thrilled to learn about all the activities, both in practice in the Spanish media landscapes that's going on in Portuguese media landscape, and also all the research taking place. And I think in the capacity of incoming editor-in-chief for digital journalism, I think I want to try to bridge some of those borders in research, because I think there's so much going on here that we need to publish for everyone else to know. We can have more discussions on that in the future. The title for the presentation is Production and Consumption of Mobile News. So essentially, I will introduce you to two overarching areas, and I've been doing research about this since 2004, when things were in its infancy, when we were essentially using feature phones, and some of us had a fantasy of the future of the smartphone. Much has happened since. Essentially, and in the vein of works by Rich Ling and others, we can see how the mobile device has transformed from being a mobile communication device, a phone, into something else. What strikes us is that we can essentially reach each other no matter where we are, beyond time and space, as networks have distributed all over the world. And I think mobile cell coverage, along with electricity, expands the territories still much further than does internet to date. Although, of course, there's an ongoing convergence between the two, as smartphones are enabling mobile internet access. For us here, this is not new, as we are encountering and appropriating and developing new patterns with mobile internet. We are familiar with internet from other devices, whereas in Africa and some other parts of the world, this is their first experience ever with the internet. And a recent book by Dutch professor Mark Duyse called Media Life, he discusses how different devices, different platforms essentially becomes the screens to our society, to our friends. And sometimes we are not always aware of what screens we are using. The media that we are using essentially becomes part of us as we are producing and consuming things through media. The screens become quite invisible to us, unless our iPhone runs out of battery or we forget to bring our tablet. Then we may become aware about their ever-presence in our everyday life. But apart from that, we normally function with them, being sort of, oops, sorry, sort of an extension of ourselves. And yeah, sometimes you bump into things and you kind of notice that they are there, taking for granted. It's real, it's there. This happened to me yesterday as I was on the bus coming here, and I had planned to kind of rehearse the literature and finalize and polish my presentation, and I was running out of battery. My laptop died after 3 flights and 4 hours on the bus, and my mobile was down to 5%. So I really had to kind of work on strategy on how I was to use my mobile. And essentially, as I had decentralized my brain to my mobile device, I didn't know where my hotel was. I was incredibly dependent on my mobile device to know and to access the calendar, the hotel booking, the directions, Google Maps, and so forth. I would not manage if the mobile would have died. I would come to the bus stop and I would not know where to go. And this kind of reminds us of the ever importance of mobile devices in our everyday life. And of course, they are becoming more and more important also in terms of their role for us in terms of producing and accessing news. They are what sociologist Elliot Urry and John Urry and Anthony Elliott would describe as miniaturized mobilities. To quote them, they are fundamental to the current phase of development of contemporary society and facilitate an intensification of life on the move through advanced new portable software and hardware products. And essentially, as they write, the mobile device, the smartphone, is par excellence a miniaturized mobility. And this involves how affordances of technology, its functionalities, its hardware and software, are built into a device to correspond with a lifestyle where we are on the go, where we feel a need to constantly, ubiquitously be updated and accessing information and being enabled to communicate, and how this transforms our patterns of life. I've essentially sketched here, within the two boundaries of mobile news consumption and mobile news production, a total of 12 areas in which I find research over the past decade. Some of these areas, the research is more mature. We find a wealth of studies. In other areas, there are not as many studies or hardly any at all. And I see here as my task to introduce you to and provide an overview of the research in some of these areas. And this is an ongoing sense-making for myself in trying to mature these research reviews. And I think you will find throughout the day how other speakers will add much more nuances and details on some of these topics, whereas I will here provide you more of the overview. But on the mobile news consumption side, we have patterns, people, place, participation, and preferences, 5 Ps. And mobile news production, we're struggling with management, production, content, distribution, user interface, personalization, and commerce. And from now, we will turn to each of them, and I will introduce you briefly to some of the research going on. In terms of patterns, we see a wealth of studies that have looked into how the mobile is being introduced into the media landscape from an audience, citizen, user, consumer perspective, and studying if this adds to so-called displacing effects, Displacing effects involves the citizen adopting the mobile device and when developing new routines with it, essentially displacing some of the previous patterns of news consumption, such as reducing the usage of the computer for online news accessing, reducing print readership, reducing watching television, and so forth. This departs from a medium-centric theory where you essentially try to look at the niches of different media, saying that some media are superior than others and inferior to the mobile device. Much debate has been on whether new and emerging media are essentially superior to the old. The debate goes on. I think it's quite questionable to try to say that the capacities and affordances of a specific media in all ways are, in an objective sense, better than something else. Some of the scholars have, based on previous research, suggested that the mobile has its niche in the interstices of everyday life. That is basically the folds between when we do other things. So when we travel from home to work, during our commute in the bus or in the subway station, people will turn to the mobile device, or when waiting for something, or during classes and so forth. I believe that quite a few of these scholars were surprised and have had to change their perceptions on what's going on when they've seen data showing that people essentially turn to their mobile device the second of being awake in the morning. They switch off the alarm, they turn to Twitter, Facebook, news applications, and even before getting out of bed, or at least once they've visited the restroom in the morning, they are already updated with the recent news through their mobile device. And from a complementary perspective, they may do so also in complementary ways with reading the printed newspaper or listening to radio or watching television and so forth. And we see in some ways that the mobile device has expanded our news day, so to speak, from the very early morning to the very late night. And we see different patterns throughout the day. In some cases, it's very brief news accessing patterns, reading a few articles or headlines, whereas in some other instances, not the least, the last hour of the day when people are, before they're going to sleep, they may turn to their mobile device and read long-form articles, spending more time. Even 5 years ago, some of the main websites in Sweden, Aftonbladet and Expressen, had more traffic from mobile devices than from tablets and computers after 9 o'clock in the evening. So it's like a mobile peak in that period of time. Still today, we're seeing quite heavy usage of computer-centric online news throughout the day. But I think here we must acknowledge that from the perspective of the user and their needs, there is a lot of complementary effects. Looking more internationally, depending on the type of study that has been performed, we're getting mixed findings into the degree which mobile devices are displacing or complementing other devices. To some people, of course, some age groups, some countries, over some time periods, there is a displacing effect. For others, it remains a complementary effect. Some will have a mobile-only news consumption pattern, and that will have implications for everything else, and others will remain in some way on a complementary way. In terms of people, when I started researching this 13 years ago, we saw very strong patterns of the early adapters in which there were only small groups of people in Sweden and elsewhere that were adopting this. We saw patterns based on it being essentially men, 15 to 49, especially among 20 to 29-year-olds. Educational level had some significance. Middle to high education played out less than the low educated. Smartphone ownership, employment, and also access to a flat rate data plan when that came in 2009 has proved to have a significance. Of course, over time, because we do surveys, cross-sectional surveys each year, over time we see that the significance of these variables, these socio-demographic variables, become less and less important, because essentially there's a pathway in which more and more people are adopting mobile news. It's becoming something for the general majority. What we have also seen here in terms of people is that it may start with the occasional. So in 2008, 2010, it would start with people doing it occasionally. They would turn to mobile news when they went to their summer house, when they went to the beach, when they went for vacations, when they were out of their normal media ecosystem, when they didn't have access to their newspaper or their television. But over time, once they turned to having a smartphone, having a flat rate subscription, developing a pattern of using different applications for mobile news, they developed quite an intensive usage pattern. And quite a few of them turn to their mobile device, opening news applications more than 20 times a day to keep informed, keep updated. And also, of course, as Xuan discusses, social media has a great importance here for them in stumbling upon news, discovering news as they browse social media, which for most part takes place through mobile devices. In terms of place, there were, in the start of this emerging area, assumptions that place would essentially be on the left screen here, people accessing news and doing mobile media when they were on the go. But we're essentially seeing how it's being domesticated also at home. Wi-Fi access, of course, plays some significance, but the complementary ways of using mobile devices for different purposes, news inclusive, has a great importance. And I wouldn't be surprised if we would see much research, not only on stress and so forth, but also, for instance, on marriage divorces because of smartphones, because essentially, some would say that there is a social cohesion, but it's a contested concept because the social dimension of the mobile also carries an antisocial dimension where mobile brings us apart in very close settings. Another area of concern and research has been participation. It's a twofold sort of research. The left picture here, you're probably familiar with it. It shows an installment in the Vatican in 2005. You will see an occasional screen, people taking pictures. And then in 2013, where essentially everyone there were documenting this with their own smartphone devices, taking pictures, sharing through social media. And they are what German-Australian professor Axel Brons would say, producers. That is the essential blending of the producer and the user. And it's a hybrid form where the audience go and switch from, in some instances, consuming and using news, and in other instances, help participating and producing it. Another dimension of participation, more relevant to democracy, has been a growing area of research on the link between mobile news accessing and political participation. In the eyes of hopes, some have portrayed this as the possibility for new groups in society to access news through mobile devices, essentially leaning on the idea that if we have informed citizens making rational choices, having access to mobile devices in a high-choice media environment, this will be good for democracy because people will know what's going on. While one can debate with all of these assumptions on rationality and informed citizenry, we're seeing mixed findings here. Some studies have indicated that it does enable groups that are, in other senses, not as interested in news to discover news through social media in the mobile or easy access through different news aggregation apps and so forth. We also see studies, most recently a review report from the Schoenstein Center at Harvard, where they problematized this development, saying that in the US, there's an increased polarization where those who are very interested in news, they turn to more news, and the mobile is a complementary way of accessing the news. And for those who are not very news savvy, it hasn't so far really shown proof in their context that it helps them. This, of course, also depends on the access to the breadth of material, because quite a few people only turn to what's free. And as we're seeing a trend having more and more content behind paywalls, or at least registration walls, there will be a sort of divide in terms of the content being accessed. There's also some research emerging on preferences to mobile news. We have what some would say mobile news avoiders, essentially avoiding the news. Whether or not this is a rational choice or not, we can debate. Or those who are omnivores, essentially going for all the news that they can, and in which mobile has enabled them to access much more news on an everyday basis. In relation to this and preferences, there has been an ongoing discussion on the role of push and pull, whether or not people prefer to turn to their branded sites with direct traffic and develop a routine similar to that of traditional news media, in which you have a relationship with the brand, or if people develop new patterns. We've seen from Zhao's research here with news aggregators, they come and play an increasingly important role. More recently, we've seen how notifications, and then of course it could be from the branded news site, but it can also be from the news aggregators, help direct the traffic. But sometimes it only means that people see the notifications, some will read the headline and the brief parts of the article. Sometimes they will turn to the article, but then move back into their mobile device and their other apps that they're using. Other research from Norway, at Trondheim, for instance, show that when you have links through social media, providing a gateway actually for the news providers to get people engaged with the mobile news site and their other news content. Typically, the user will turn to the news article recommended by a friend. They will spend more time with that news article as compared to other news article they engage with in their mobile device, but they will not go to other content. They will return back to the social media news app or the social media app like Facebook and browse other content. So they're struggling to engage beyond these recommended articles. We've had here discussions also on native apps or responsive sites, the personalized content versus the traditional news buffet, and complement and substitute. All in all, different sorts of studies and discussions on what purposes and functionalities mobile devices and the news services they provide can essentially offer and should offer in relation to other things. And in relation to this, we've seen some news media companies earlier on essentially selecting very limited types of content as compared to their other platforms. Turning to the production side and a sort of media management perspective, there has been some research on what I would call organizational approaches to the mobile within cross-media news work. Essentially, quite a few legacy news media have moved from providing and publishing news for one platform to 2 and then 3 and 4, and essentially quite a few, including not only the proprietary but also the non-proprietary. And from my own research, I looked at how news publishers were over time making sense of how they can approach mobile media, mobile news, and mobile news services. Research in this vein involves strategic developments, partnerships with external consultants and firms for things like editorial content management systems, advertising solutions, the ad tech industry. It involves trying to establish and manage routines and new workflows when the mobile device is included. It involves inter-organizational collaboration. In my study, I did interviews and observations of not only the journalists, but also the business people and the technologists, as they were forming groups to work across the different department borders within these news organizations, essentially saying mobile news is a form of development that requires us to approach it from a journalistic editorial point of view, a technological point of view, and a business point of view. And from start, they wanted to engage the different professionals with their expertise in trying to negotiate what could be accomplished in order to make the best of the technology, make the best of their journalistic competence, and also to ensure that they will make money rather than spend money by doing so. And I think this is a salient example of a larger trend taking place in many legacy media organizations, in which this sort of trisection management is getting rooted. Also, we have questions here relating to how to balance the approaches of human versus technology-led publishing. Already 10 years ago, there were discussions in the Scandinavian countries on what type of content should be manually distributed, what should be automatically distributed, what role can technology play in personalizing content in different ways, in what ways do we need humans to do the traditional work of editing. And in this salient case, they had been working with a mobile editor and a team of mobile editors to edit pictures presented. So for instance, pre-smartphone era, they would replace pictures used for the web of a soccer game where you would have 10 soccer players displayed on the picture. The mobile editor would essentially replace that picture with a picture of the soccer player doing most goals, up like a profile picture, because that's what you could see with a small screen. They would edit titles and many things to make it fit. But they were, of course, struggling because there were so many different web browsers and interfaces and mobile devices that there was a constant problem here. And we have seen shifts in many of the news organizations in how they approach this. What's the role of having humans working with this, and what's the role of technology? And we can turn back to that question because I think it's a important one. The visual here represents the result of a very, very important process that took place in Sweden's second largest quality newspaper. It comes from a previous publication. Essentially, it's a weighing scale that I've used to try to visualize the outcome of year-long processes in which the different inter-organizational parties negotiated the future of an iPhone application as a strategic venture in the company. So on the one end, we have the editorial and IT department, and they formed a coalition. The editorial department have, since a very long time, had most power within the organization, and the technologists of the IT department kind of served as a support function within the organization, but they had all the technical skills that were needed to develop an iPhone application with external partners. And this took the course of more than a year-long negotiation process in which they essentially said that they were to do what they had always done. We can see this in research from Spain, Portugal, Latin America, other parts of Europe. Many news organizations have essentially approached new digital media by doing what they have always done. And what they did here was to say, we are to focus on traditional journalism, culture journalism, local journalism, the things that we are good at, that we've been working on for 150 years, that the people expect from us, and so forth. But what's important to acknowledge here is that when you approach new media, like the mobile device, it contains and offers affordances that are quite specific to the device. Within the architecture of the platforms, you can do new things, things that you can't do with the newspaper. So they were struggling how to make sense of location-based technology, personalization features, and so forth, user-generated content. But they added it as features, and rather than labeling it as participatory journalism, they would label it as user-generated content, because in that sense it wouldn't be journalism. Coming from the other end, though, the business department, they had a coalition with the most prominent digital PR firm in Sweden, Forsman Bodenfors. I'm not sure you're familiar, for instance, with the YouTube videos that sometimes go viral with Zlatan Ibrahimovic for Volvo. You familiar with those? Those are produced by that PR company. I mean, they gain traction all over the world. They've won many prizes for their marketing and PR work. So they're, in my eyes, they're quite competent. And basically what they suggested at this point of time was that the brand of Göteborgs-Posten, you're lagging a bit behind. You need to kind of reinvent yourself and do something new for in terms of marking your position and being a forward-thinking company. And so they proposed an application, and some of you will be familiar with the idea of really working with the audience in terms of participatory journalism. So they suggested to build in functionalities in which they would make an even split between professional journalism by the staff of Göteborgs-Posten and a split with participatory journalism by the citizens of Gothenburg, and that the application would enable this by easy access to recording of audio and video and reporting through live streams and so forth. And they were planning to make a big thing out of this for marketing purposes. However, and to come to the point, they lost this internal negotiation. And so from the outcome, they made it sort of a balanced negotiation in which they included a small feature in which people of Gothenburg could upload content from sites they visited. Like they see a nice building in the city or something going on, they could take pictures and upload it. For some strange reason, they chose to use MMS technology, even though this was like 2009. It was outdated. The CMS was really bad. And so they managed to negotiate this internally and with the external technology firm, and then in the long run with Apple, who approved of it, and they take 30% cut of all the revenues. It was officially launched by the summer as planned, and then they started measuring its success. The download rates were great. People were spending much more time with the brand and accessing news once the app had been launched. Traffic really exploded. So the editorial and technical department, they were really happy with their choices, and they were evaluating the participatory functionalities, essentially concluding people are not using this. And so from the editorial and IT department, and this is quite important, I don't have time to go into all the details, but essentially from a theoretical framework of sense-making, Carl Weick and a social constructionist perspective on how you make sense of things. One of the key components there is that you see things, sometimes you see things that you think are right, and then you will look for the confirmation, confirming that you are right. What they did here is really, they saw something, they restricted the affordances and functionalities, they created something that was really determined to not succeed by using MMS technology. They didn't do any marketing of it, and they put it in the very low bottoms of the mobile app, so no one could find it, and they didn't use any marketing whatsoever to tell anyone that they have launched this functionality, because the business department, they were not in favor of it. They were ashamed to even tell their users that they had launched this functionality. But they made very different interpretations of the outcome. So the editorial department essentially said, we are very happy we did this way because this was a failure. It would have been very bad. The business department on the other end, they said, of course it's a failure. We didn't promote it. We did put it down there. We've not done nothing to make it succeed. So there was a conflict in how they interpreted it. The thing is, it was the representatives of the editorial department that were invited to visit other newspapers and news media around Sweden, Scandinavia, went to one IFRA conferences and INMA conferences saying, avoid this, you shouldn't do this, but they didn't give really the context. And it kind of reproduces ideas of what can be done and what cannot be done, but sometimes you miss the entire context. And I think that's quite important in an industry in which we learn from each other. We have also on the production end a growing area of research looking into so-called mobile journalists, mojos, and the individual multi-skilling that they do. In some places, this has been growing from a grassroots level with journalists taking initiatives by themselves. We've seen that many cases in Sweden from 2005, 6, 7, and so forth, in which they were starting to use more and more features of the mobile device, publishing mobile pictures and so forth, slowly displacing the professional photographers. Internationally, we've seen work done by Ivo Burum and Stephen Quinn, among others, kind of leading, also educating mojos around the world and publishing some of the books here. And essentially what we're seeing is that instead of sending both journalists and cameramen to the site, many journalists will develop multi-skilled skills so that they can record videos, take pictures, send live streams, make interviews with their iPhone, and essentially learn and adapt to use different technological applications and tools with their mobile device to report from the field. And in many news organizations, we kind of cut the news editor. So you use editorial CMS, where the news reporter will report instantaneously into the editorial CMS and it get published. And if it's low quality, the news editor will check on the quality afterwards, or the audiences will. But mojos are growing, and it's also growing in parallel to the financial constraints of legacy news media. I'm sure you will hear much more details and success stories about this in the afternoon. We have the content side, where essentially mobile news has turned from a peripheral activity, becoming more and more mobile first, thinking in terms of how can we create content for the mobile, publishing it quickly. There's been constraints within editorial CMSs. There's been strategic discussions on what content is to be published for which platform. Is it to be the same content for both websites and mobile applications, or is one to make more brief excerpts for mobile devices? Now we're seeing this with notifications, pulling people into their platforms, whereas you essentially provide more and more of the content. We're also seeing a growth in terms of mobile video, more and more content being accessed in the video format. Although one must be very sensible to that people are using the mobile device not only when they are by themselves, but also among others, so that you can't have auto-load of mobile videos that will interrupt or interfere. For instance, if some of you would find this boring and start browsing videos and it starts with sound in the fourth line, everyone would know that you're doing something else. Things like that has happened, and the legacy news media have tried to adapt to this. And then, of course, there's this discussion on measurement of videos, where Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and others are using very different lengths as they measure. We have distribution. A key discussion here and important for the future is proprietary platforms, the apps, news sites, as opposed to non-proprietary platforms into which a lot of the news is being distributed. And we should keep in mind that Facebook and these other social media platforms have invested heavily in being mobile-first companies, and we see that most of their traffic is coming from mobile devices. So mobile news is closely linked to social media, and this is also making salient the transition in which legacy news media are losing their control over their platforms. While they still must retain and work heavily with their editorial CMS to make things look good, customizing content for different platforms, I would be prepared to say, while we have had a long history of consultants, researchers, and practitioners saying it's important to customize news for each platform, it's becoming increasingly problematic to maintain that position in an age of non-proprietary platforms, because essentially news media must adapt and publish content that works more platform agnostic, that can be distributed across so many platforms as possible, redistributed. A news article published by a local newspaper in Spain, redistributed through social media, may end up being converted from text to speech, read aloud in a virtual assistant or Amazon speaker. And I think bringing this into context, it kind of sets perspective of what you can do with a specific news article. And I think we need to embed more journalistic meta-communication into articles. We have the user interface. Here we have research and discussions on the affordances and digital architectures of, for instance, native apps, progressive web apps, mobile news sites. We have user experience design, discussing more in the technology literature, accessibility, user-friendliness, usability, and all together, these are very, very important to the business model. And I think Juan, although not comprehending all of what you were discussing, you discussed load times for different applications and in relation to paywalls and ads. And I think this is a really crucial question. We have seen many examples of load times being a big problem, especially perhaps in the past. Now the non-proprietary companies to legacy news media are reducing load times with Facebook instant articles and so forth. But then we have the other dimension of this, of losing the control. Of course, it's less of a problem with 4G networks and flat rates, but still something that really needs to be worked on. Quite a few are trying to create the appearance of an app while still using the web interface. And I think one key thing to remember here is that when working with Apple, you're essentially in their hands. You need everything approved by Apple, and they will take 30% of the revenues. So even though from a user perspective, many iPhone users would feel natural that you are developing and providing services through the Apple ecosystem, from a news media perspective, it's not all that easy to approach that question. We have concerns and research on personalization. One approach here is for users being allowed to make settings and preferences of their own, but this is also the matter of increasingly personalization taking place even if people are non-aware of it. And given that the mobile device to most of us is a truly personal device, it's not a device that we share with others, as could be the case with a stationary computer at home or the tablet being shared among different members of the household, the mobile device, in most cases, is a personal device. You log in using your thumb or eye recognition or a keyword, and everything is personalized to you. And here, algorithms learn from both your individual usage and aggregated usage patterns, filtering out the news people want. And I think here, yes, perhaps it's not as simple as this in reality, but to kind of make the distinction as clear as possible. From the perspective of many news industry companies, it's quite unproblematic to apply personalization and working with algorithms to make content more relevant and increase engagement. And this kind of, we give you what you want. We learn from your patterns of use and we give you more of it. And the main idea here is to increase engagement, make people come to the branded news site or application more often, spend more time there, expose themselves for more content, perhaps being willing to pay, and so forth. When I was on a jury for different mobile news applications for World Association of Newspapers recently, basically all the news applications were promoting their case based on this rhetoric that they were so successful, so innovative in developing their applications in this direction, using the technology. From another perspective, though, there's been concerns raised from the perspective of democracy and informed citizenry, because basically this may raise echo chambers and filter bubbles and so forth. Only 1 week ago, there was a large project involving industry players and many universities in Sweden receiving more than 2 million euros for a project in which they are to democratize news algorithms and so forth. There's another project in Trondheim in Norway. And so basically, what's the baseline of how these operate? And will they be successful? I'm not sure. But essentially, the personalization app will instead work, okay, you are reading a lot here about Hollywood and entertainment and a lot about soccer. Perhaps you would want to look at this news about the election and Trump, or political news, or the finance of Spain. It could be important and worthwhile for you. So basically what the app will do is to detect your patterns and not only giving you more and more of what you're already consuming, but to suggest to you, hey, don't miss out of these extremely important news. And they're working in a subtle way of how to promote news in that way. It's more of a public service news provider perspective into the app. But I just want to say that there's research and projects going on in both of these directions. And of course, it relates to commerce. And I think we learned a lot from Juan Miguel's presentation here recently. But of course, the shift towards mobile screens represents a big challenge. Some have said many times that the shift from print to online has been the shift from dollars to cents, and the shift to mobile from cents to dimes. Of course, we're seeing a rocketing in mobile advertising, but it's more easily accessible with mobile ad blockers, and people so far haven't paid more for mobile devices, mobile news content than in other domains, although there are some hopes that this could be different, because a mobile news app is more tangible. You can have the app within your mobile device, whereas online news is more of a flow, which you don't really see as hardly what you pay for. And of course, there are other opportunities for creating mobile-specific content. I just want to share with you an example I think is quite interesting. Largest Swedish news tabloid have since a few years worked with companies providing location-based ads. So basically, they can detect, based on millions of Swedes using their application, where they are, what time of the day, what the kind of interest they have, and kind of merged different databases. And one of their most successful advertising campaigns was for an ice cream producer, in which they would locate throughout the summer. And not like Spain and Portugal, we can go to the beach every day and it's always hot. But in Sweden, we're happy with a few weeks per year. And if it's very hot, we enjoy it. And people buy ice cream more often. And so basically, they used data on the temperature. So it was 28 degrees. It was 10 in the morning. This is a good day for ice cream. And to everyone who was at the beach using this news application, they would send personalized advertising in which they would receive a coupon with like 30% off of ice cream if they would buy it between certain number of hours, like between 11 and 1 that day. And it's just skyrocketed. Every time they put that campaign on, people were buying ice creams. So everyone was happy with that type of campaign. And I think we will see more innovation in terms of these sorts. And it could possibly be successful also here, as you are spending much time at the beach. Anyhow, thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Oscar. So we have some time to ask. You are on the line, so please, maybe 2, 3 questions, okay? Okay. First one, okay. In this screen society, as you told before, what do you think about of the future of the paper? Do you think that we have newspaper, I mean, news in the paper in the future, or the screen society will control everything in the future?
I think what we're seeing is a shift back to the situation where printed newspapers was more of an elite news medium, something for fewer. While it has been a mass media for most of the 20th century, we're now seeing a quite fast shift back towards fewer and fewer reading it. And we're seeing that because there is a break even for many newspapers in maintaining printing presses and the big apparatus. And even though they are using the same printing presses, sharing resources, it's becoming more and more expensive to print and distribute each paper. So in many countries, what's happening is that they're reducing the number of days in which the newspaper is being printed. They're reducing and slowing down the delivery. So from the same day with exclusive delivery, it comes with the mail the day after. And we're seeing more and more initiatives being successful in which you co-combine your subscription between screen and print, but where print is only once or twice a week for the weekend for the long read. And so I think in the long run, we will see a shift where print is terminated entirely at some newspapers, and at some they will provide it only for the weekend. And the other will be online based, and in my view, mobile will play a key component in that development, for sure.
Yeah. So, other questions? Sorry, the microphone. Okay, for you and after for you. Okay.
Yeah, Oscar, I would like to know your opinion about what you think about fake news in the global environment of you described before.
Yes, like that. Yes, this small question. Fake news has always been present. It has become the word of the year. The last year, it's been gaining a lot of attention in the news media industry and among researchers. But the phenomenon is not new, but now we're paying closer scrutiny to it. It's a chance for news media to more strongly position themselves as producers of non-fake news, while it's also a challenge for them to claim that they produce real news, objective news, that they have production process that really are always in a systematic way providing something that's fact-based. And they need to work much harder with this. I think altogether we're seeing that our definitions of journalism must focus more strongly on how journalism is being produced, the epistemological news production process, the norms, ideals, and standards involved in producing news. And news can take different forms of news, live news, and so forth. The key thing here is that once it's being produced, it turns into sort of a news product. And what fake news and the stakeholders behind fake news, similarly to native advertising, are doing is that they imitate the product. And when it's being published a lot and accessed through non-proprietary platforms, that is social media, we have a problem of, and Juan Miguel was discussing this too today, I think, a problem of for the audience to detect what's fake news and what's coming from the news media if you don't really see the brand. So there we have a really, really big challenge. And I think in many ways we are seeing that there's a shift in responsibility moving from news media producers and the producers of news to the audience to detect what's good and what's not. And I think it's unreasonable to ask of the citizens to be able to do this, because, I mean, all in all, of course, you can speak of news literacy and media literacy, and UNESCO can have their programs, and we can define, and we can have schools and libraries work with this. But I'm pessimistic. They are not capable, even those who are educating are not capable of detecting fake news in every case. They don't have the instruments to do it. It's so sophisticated. Even the best people are not able to, in all cases, detect the fake news. And even if you apply artificial intelligence and verification systems, it won't be sufficient by itself. So one of the things that I'm envisioning will become more and more important is what we call, in a chapter I submitted actually yesterday, embedded meta communication. So it will be for news producers, journalistic news producers, to include within the news material that becomes the product that travels through all different screens and platforms, proprietary and non-proprietary. Within it contain institutional markers and bit-size information, water stamps and so forth, that will provide authenticity of what this really is. Because you lose the context of it being published in a newspaper. You don't see the brand, you don't see the byline. Everything has to be included into the story. Of course, producers of fake news can quite easily imitate also that, but at least you're working into that direction. And here will be a fierce struggle. Many of us will be deceived in future elections.
Yeah. Okay, the last one.
Well, I think it's a bit related with the last question, but in terms of fake news and maybe a more distorted image of reality that we get with that massive approach of information, isn't that taking us a bit of our democracy? Because in the terms of participation, you talked about that we have a lot of information, so there is more democracy. But what about that information that shows us a fake reality? isn't that a loss of democracy?
Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint, which is often referred, it's having an informed citizenry that are rationally making choices based on good public information. Of course, if good public information is infected with not good public information and you cannot see the difference, it will become a problem. Whereas I would say that having a plurality of voices involving alternative media and citizen journalism and other forms of public opinion could be good. The problem would be, of course, if you only turn to certain voices to confirm your ideological standpoints and you don't look into the broader news, then it's a problem. And of course, if fake news, as we have seen in many cases, gains a lot of traction.
Okay. So we are dry. So I propose to stop here and to take a break.
Thanks for your questions.
Thank you very much to Oscar. So thank you very much. En 10 minutos aquí, vale, para a seguinte sesión. Sobre as 12, son as 12 menos 5, as 12:05, así, aquí, vale, 10 minutos.